That day in the kitchen took my breath away. She came into the kitchen, pulled open her blouse, and moved forward towards me, and shut the door behind her. The kitchen tile was cool against my feet that summer morning as I watched Becca reach for the top shelf, her oversized sleep shirt riding up to reveal a flash of black lace. My stepsister had moved in just 3 months ago, and these small moments of proximity were starting to drive me crazy. The way her honey blonde hair cascaded down her back, how she hummed softly while making coffee, even the lingering scent of her jasmine perfume in the air. It was all becoming an exquisite torture. That morning, something crackled between us as she turned and caught me staring. Instead of her usual eye roll, she held my gaze for just a beat too long. My throat went dry. Blood rushed in my ears. Then Dad called from upstairs, shattering the moment. Now let me roll back to when I was first introduced to Becca. When my dad sat me down one evening, he had this look on his face I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual serious, we need to talk expression, nor was it the cheerful tone he used when there was good news. It was something in between, guarded, maybe even a little nervous. "Steve," he started, "I have something important to tell you." I leaned back in my chair, ready for whatever speech he was about to give. Was he thinking about selling the house? Quitting his job? I braced myself. Whatever it was, I figured I could handle it. Then he said it. "I'm getting married." I blinked. "Married? Like, soon?" "Next month," he replied, as if that was a perfectly normal timeline. I sat forward. "Wait, hold on. Married? To who?" "To Melissa. We've been dating for almost 2 years now," he said, his tone cautious. "I know it's been under the radar, but it's serious. We're ready for this step." Melissa. I vaguely remembered him mentioning her name once or twice. They'd gone to dinner, seen a play, that sort of thing. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was just another casual relationship. My dad hadn't been seriously involved with anyone since the divorce 5 years ago. Apparently, I'd missed the memo that this one was different. "Okay," I said slowly, still trying to process. "You're getting married. That's big news." He nodded. "I know. And there's something else." Here it comes, I thought. He probably wants me to move out so they can have the house to themselves. I couldn't blame him. What newlyweds wanted a 20-year-old college student hanging around their place? I was already mentally calculating how much a cheap studio apartment might cost when he dropped the real bomb. "She has a daughter, Becca. She's your age." I stared at him. "Wait, what? A daughter? My age?" He nodded, still avoiding my gaze. "Yes, she's 22. She and Melissa will be moving in with us after the wedding." This was a twist I hadn't seen coming. It wasn't just about sharing my space with Melissa. I was going to have a new stepsister, someone I'd never even met, living under the same roof. My peaceful, predictable life was about to get a lot more complicated. The day Melissa and Becca moved in, I was a ball of nerves. I wasn't sure what to expect. Would they be friendly? Standoffish? How were we supposed to go from being total strangers to family overnight? Melissa seemed nice enough when she arrived. She was all smiles and warm greetings, giving my dad a kiss on the cheek before turning to me. "You must be Steve," she said, extending a hand. "I've heard so much about you." I shook her hand and mumbled something polite in return. Then she turned toward the doorway, and I knew what was coming next. "And this is Becca," Melissa said. Becca stepped into the room, and the first thing I noticed was her confidence. She had this air about her that made it seem like she owned the place, even though she'd just walked in. Her dark hair was tied up in a messy bun, and she wore ripped jeans and a leather jacket, her hands casually tucked into the pockets. She didn't look like someone who was about to move into a new house and meet her new family. She looked like someone who couldn't care less what anyone thought. "Hey," she said simply, glancing at me with a half smile. "Hi," I replied, feeling awkward. What was I supposed to say to my new stepsister? "Welcome, I guess." She nodded and walked past me to grab a box from the moving truck. No small talk, no questions, just straight to business. I wasn't sure whether to admire her efficiency or be annoyed by her lack of enthusiasm. Over the next few hours, I watched as Becca and Melissa settled in. Melissa was bubbly and chatty, asking questions about the house and making an effort to include me in conversations. Becca, on the other hand, was quiet. She didn't seem unfriendly exactly, but she wasn't going out of her way to be friendly either. She was polite, but distant. The first time we actually interacted one-on-one was later that evening. I was in the kitchen, unloading the dishwasher, when she walked in. She leaned against the counter, watching me for a moment before speaking. "Right. Do you always leave the silverware soaking wet like that?" she asked. I turned to look at her, surprised by the comment. No. I was about to dry them." She raised an eyebrow. "Sure you were." I wasn't sure whether to laugh or be annoyed. "Do you always critique people's dishwashing skills, or is this a special occasion?" She smirked. "Only when it's this bad." I couldn't help but laugh. There was something disarming about her bluntness. It was clear she wasn't trying to be mean. This was just how she was. I decided to roll with it. "Well, if you're such an expert, feel free to show me how it's done," I said, holding out a damp fork. She shook her head. "Nice try. This is your mess, not mine." And with that, she grabbed a soda from the fridge and left the room. It wasn't much, but it was a start. At least she didn't seem to hate me. That was something. The days stretched into weeks, and the tension in the house began to ease, replaced by something closer to a tentative routine. Melissa had fully settled in with my dad, filling the house with her cheerful energy. She had a knack for smoothing over awkward silences and finding ways to make this blended family feel less like strangers thrown together and more like a unit. Becca, on the other hand, was still a bit of a mystery. Becca wasn't the kind of person you got to know easily. She wasn't rude or closed off, but she had this way of keeping people at arm's length. She didn't offer much about herself unless you asked, and even then, her answers were usually short and to the point. It wasn't until one late night, about a month after they moved in, that I felt like I saw a crack in the armor. I'd spent the day at the campus library, cramming for an exam that felt like it was going to eat me alive. By the time I got home, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the TV in the living room. Becca was sprawled out on the couch, her legs tucked under a blanket, and a bowl of popcorn balanced precariously on her stomach. She glanced over as I dropped my bag by the door. "Hey," she said, her voice soft but not sleepy. "Late night?" "Yeah," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. "You?" She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." I hesitated, unsure whether to leave her alone or join her. Before I could decide, she pointed at the TV. "Blade Runner," she said, a hint of enthusiasm in her tone. "The original. You seen it?" "Of course," I replied, relaxing a little. "It's a classic." "Good. Sit," she said, patting the cushion next to her. "I'm at the best part." I sat down, keeping a careful distance, but grateful for the invitation. The hum of the TV filled the silence as I sank into the couch. For a while, neither of us spoke. We just watched as Deckard navigated the neon-lit streets of a dystopian Los Angeles. The movie felt timeless, but sitting there next to Becca gave it a new kind of gravity. When the credits finally rolled, she turned to me, her expression serious. "So, is Deckard a replicant or not?" I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden question. "I don't know. That's the whole point, isn't it?" She grinned. Cop-out answer. "Fine," I said, leaning back. "I think he is. The unicorn dream, the origami, it's all there." She shook her head. "Wrong. He's human. Otherwise, the story loses its emotional weight." We went back and forth, debating the themes and nuances of the movie until we were both laughing, throwing popcorn at each other like kids. It was the most relaxed I'd felt in weeks, and I realized something that both comforted and unnerved me. I liked talking to her. More than that, I liked being around her. Becca and I fell into an unspoken rhythm after that night. It wasn't like we suddenly became inseparable or anything, but the tension between us softened. She'd linger in the kitchen while I made coffee, cracking jokes or asking me random questions about my day. I started looking forward to those moments, even if I didn't admit it to myself. One Saturday afternoon, we were both home alone. My dad and Melissa had gone out for the day, leaving the house unusually quiet. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my laptop, when Becca wandered in. She was wearing a tank top and a pair of cut-off shorts, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She grabbed an apple from the counter and leaned against the fridge, scrolling through her phone. "What are you working on?" she asked, nodding toward my laptop. "Just an essay," I replied, trying to focus on the screen. I could feel her presence, though, like a faint hum in the background. "Fun," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. She took a bite of her apple and came around to peer over my shoulder. "What's it about?" "Postmodern literature," I said, fighting the urge to close the laptop. Her proximity was distracting. "Sounds riveting," she said, her breath warm against my neck. I turned to look at her, and for a split second, our eyes met. She held my gaze, her expression unreadable, before stepping back. "Well, don't let me distract you," she said with a smirk, retreating to the living room. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She had a way of making the simplest interactions feel charged, like there was always something unspoken hanging in the air. Later that evening, we ended up in the kitchen again. I was rummaging through the fridge when she walked in, barefoot and carrying a sketch pad. She set it on the counter and flipped through the pages, her brow furrowed. "Working on something?" I asked, glad for a distraction. "Yeah," she said, not looking up. "An art project for class. It's supposed to be about identity, but I'm stuck." "Can I see?" I asked, genuinely curious. She hesitated, then slid the sketch pad across the counter. The pages were filled with intricate drawings, faces, hands, abstract shapes that seemed to flow together in a chaotic but deliberate way. I was struck by how personal it all felt, like she'd poured pieces of herself onto the paper. "These are amazing," I said, meaning it. "Thanks," she said quietly, her confidence flickering for the first time. "It's just hard, you know? Trying to put yourself on display like this." I nodded, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite name. "Yeah, I get that, but you're good at it. Really good." She smiled, and for a moment, the distance between us felt smaller. It started with the little things. Maybe that's how it always happens. Small moments that slip under your radar until, one day, they're all you can think about. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it began, but somewhere between sharing late-night movie marathons and debating the merits of science fiction versus fantasy, I started noticing Becca in a way I hadn't before. It wasn't just her appearance, though that was impossible to ignore. She had a kind of effortless beauty that didn't feel curated or self-conscious. Her hair was always tied back in a loose bun, a few strands escaping to frame her face. She rarely wore makeup, but her features didn't need embellishment. There was something raw and genuine about her, as though she didn't care about impressing anyone, and maybe that was what made her so captivating. But it was more than that. It was the way she moved, with a mix of confidence and ease, like she owned every room she walked into. It was the way she spoke, direct, unfiltered, with just the right amount of sarcasm to keep me on my toes. It was the way her laughter could fill a room, light and full, breaking through even the heaviest silences. I noticed the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she smiled, a rare but unguarded kind of joy that felt like a privilege to witness. I noticed how she chewed on the inside of her cheek when she was concentrating, her brow furrowed in thought. I noticed how she had a habit of doodling on napkins and scrap paper, leaving little works of art scattered around the house like breadcrumbs leading back to her. It was all these little details that stuck with me, long after the moments themselves had passed. They added up, weaving together a picture of someone who was both familiar and utterly new. One afternoon, I found her in the backyard, sitting cross-legged on the grass with her sketch pad balanced on her knees. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across her face. She was so absorbed in her drawing that she didn't notice me at first. I stood there for a moment, watching her, before clearing my throat. She looked up, startled, then gave me a half smile. Spying on me, huh? Just passing through, I said, trying to sound casual. What are you working on? She flipped the sketch pad closed, hugging it to her chest. Just some random stuff, nothing exciting. Come on, I said, sitting down beside her. I've seen your work, it's always exciting. She hesitated, then handed me the sketch pad. The pages were filled with intricate line work, trees, flowers, a winding path that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. There was something mesmerizing about it, like it was a glimpse into her mind. This is amazing, I said, meaning it. She shrugged, looking away. It's just a hobby. No, I said firmly. It's more than that. You're really talented, Becca. She glanced at me, her expression softening. Thanks, she said quietly. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of us. The warmth of the sun, the rustle of the leaves, the faint hum of distant traffic. It all faded into the background. I could feel her presence beside me, steady and grounding, like she belonged there. I also started noticing how much I missed her when she wasn't around. She'd disappear into her room for hours, lost in her art or on calls with friends, and I'd find myself glancing at the clock, wondering when she'd emerge. When she did, it was like the house came alive again. One evening, I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through my laptop, when she walked in. She was wearing a loose sweatshirt and a pair of shorts, her hair damp from a shower. She grabbed a soda from the fridge and leaned against the counter, her eyes scanning the room. What are you working on? She asked, nodding toward my screen. Nothing exciting, I said, my focus shifting entirely to her. She raised an eyebrow. That vague, huh? Just homework, I admitted, trying to knock it out before the weekend. She took a sip of her soda, then tilted her head, studying me. You always look so serious when you're working. Comes with the territory, I said with a shrug. What about you? What's on your agenda? Absolutely nothing, she said, her lips curving into a grin. Want to procrastinate together? The offer was so simple, yet it made something inside me stir. Spending time with Becca had become the highlight of my days, even if it was just sitting around doing nothing. I closed my laptop and joined her in the living room, grateful for the distraction. As time went on, I found myself looking for excuses to be around her. I'd linger in the kitchen when I knew she'd be coming in for a snack. I'd suggest movie nights, just to sit beside her on the couch. I'd offer to help with her art projects, even though I had no artistic talent to speak of. It wasn't just about spending time together. It was about the way she made me feel. She had this way of making even the most mundane moments feel significant, like they mattered just because she was part of them. She challenged me, pushed me to see things from new perspectives, and made me laugh in a way that felt effortless and free. At the same time, I started noticing the way she looked at me. It wasn't anything overt, but there were moments when I'd catch her gaze lingering a second too long, or when she'd smile at something I said, her eyes soft with unspoken affection. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into things. But part of me couldn't help wondering if she felt it too. This strange, unexplainable connection between us. It was terrifying and exhilarating all at once, like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to step back or leap forward. Then we had the kitchen encounter I talked about earlier. The way Becca's fingertips trailed across the kitchen counter after she walked in that morning made my skin prickle. Every movement deliberate, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing. Her sleep-mussed hair caught the early sunlight as she stretched up toward the coffee mugs, that thin tank top betraying every curve. I gripped my phone tighter, pretending to read emails while stealing glances. Steve? The way she purred my name lately had changed. Gone was the annoyed tone from when our parents first married. Now it dripped like honey, dangerous and sweet. Could you help me reach? I tried to maintain composure. She pressed back slightly, so subtle it could have been accidental. But nothing was accidental with Becca anymore. Just last week, she left her diary open on the kitchen table. I shouldn't have looked. But those words on the page about me, Christ. She had to have left it open on purpose for me to find. 4 agonizing months of this game, the innocent touches, those moments she'd catch my eye across the dinner table and slowly lick her fork clean, the late-night encounters in the hallway where she'd brush past wearing next to nothing. Dad had gone out for the day with his friends, and it was just me and her. The door was closed and the months of tension was released in that moment. Our bond deepened in ways I hadn't expected. It wasn't a sudden dramatic shift. It was more like a quiet unfolding, a series of small moments that gradually drew us closer. Becca and I fell into an easy rhythm, and the house, once a place of awkward silences, now felt alive with shared laughter and conversations that stretched late into the night. One Saturday morning, I woke to the smell of coffee wafting through the house. I followed it into the kitchen and found Becca standing by the counter, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail. She was wearing an oversized sweatshirt that hung off one shoulder, exposing the strap of her tank top beneath. She looked up when I entered, her face lighting up with a smile. "Morning, sleepyhead," she teased, sliding a mug of coffee toward me. "Morning," I replied, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," she said, shrugging. "Just figured I'd make coffee. Thought you might need it." "Thanks," I said, taking a sip. It was perfectly made, just the right balance of bitterness and sweetness. "You've got a talent for this." She grinned. "Don't get used to it. This is a one-time deal." We ended up sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and talking about nothing in particular. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over everything. It felt peaceful, like the rest of the world had faded away, and it was just us. Later that week, she dragged me to an art exhibit downtown. I wasn't exactly an art enthusiast, but I agreed to go, partly because I didn't want to disappoint her, and partly because I was curious to see her in her element. The gallery was small and intimate, the walls lined with paintings and sculptures that ranged from the abstract to the surreal. Becca moved through the space with a quiet reverence, her eyes scanning each piece as if trying to decipher its secrets. I followed her lead, though I didn't pretend to understand most of what I was looking at. At one point, she stopped in front of a painting, a swirling mix of colors that seemed to pulse with energy. "What do you think?" she asked, glancing at me. "It's interesting," I said, trying to sound thoughtful. "What's it supposed to be?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "It's not about what it's supposed to be. It's about what it makes you feel." I looked at the painting again, trying to see it the way she did. "It feels chaotic, but also kind of alive, like it's moving, even though it's not." Her expression softened and she nodded. "Exactly. That's the point." I realized then how much her world was different from mine. She saw things in ways I never would, finding beauty and meaning in places I didn't even think to look. It was inspiring and a little humbling. One night, we ended up in the backyard, sitting on the grass under a sky full of stars. It had been a long day for both of us, school, work, the usual grind, and we'd both needed a break. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees that lined the yard. Becca stretched out beside me, her hands folded behind her head. "You ever think about how small we are?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Like, in the grand scheme of things?" I replied. "Yeah," she said, staring up at the sky. "All those stars, all those galaxies. And here we are, just tiny specks in the middle of it all." I nodded, following her gaze. "It's kind of terrifying when you think about it." "Maybe," she said. "But it's also freeing. Like none of it really matters, so you might as well do what makes you happy." Her words hung in the air, sinking into the silence between us. I turned to look at her, the soft glow of moonlight catching her profile. She seemed so serene, so at peace with the world in that moment. It made me wonder if she ever felt the same weight I did. The pressure to be something, to do something, to matter. "What makes you happy?" I asked, breaking the silence. She smiled, a faraway look in her eyes. Moments like this. Being with people who matter." The way she said it, so casually and yet so deeply, made something inside me shift. I realized then how much she'd come to mean to me. Not just as my stepsister, but as a person. She'd become someone I could confide in, someone who made me laugh, someone who made the world feel a little less overwhelming. Another time, we decided to bake cookies together, a spontaneous project born out of sheer boredom. Neither of us had much experience in the kitchen, which quickly became apparent as flour and sugar ended up everywhere except the mixing bowl. "You're doing it wrong," Becca said, laughing as I struggled to crack an egg without breaking the yolk. "Am not," I protested, though the evidence suggested otherwise. She grabbed the bowl from me, her hands brushing mine. "Here, let me." I watched as she cracked the egg effortlessly, her movements quick and practiced. She glanced up at me, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "See? Easy." "Show off," I muttered, but I couldn't help smiling. By the time we finished, the kitchen was a disaster, but the cookies turned out surprisingly decent. We sat on the counter, eating them straight off the baking sheet, laughing about how close we'd come to burning the house down. "You know," she said between bites, "we actually make a pretty good team." "Yeah," I said, looking at her. "We do." It wasn't just about the cookies. It was about the way we worked together, the way we laughed and teased and made something out of nothing. It was about the way she made me feel, like I wasn't just surviving, but living. Over time, these shared experiences became the threads that wove us together. Whether it was late-night conversations, impromptu adventures, or quiet moments of understanding, each one added another layer to our bond. She wasn't just my stepsister anymore. She was my friend, my confidant, my anchor. And yet, there was always that unspoken undercurrent, that sense that our connection ran deeper than either of us wanted to admit. It scared me, but it also made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for certain. Becca had changed my life, and I wasn't sure I could imagine it without her anymore. Becca and I spent more time together than ever, watching movies, working on her art projects, or just sitting in comfortable silence. Each shared moment brought us closer, though neither of us seemed willing to address the growing undercurrent between us. One night, we were sitting in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the walls. Becca was sketching something on her pad, her brow furrowed in concentration, while I flipped through a book I wasn't really reading. The silence between us was companionable, but charged, like there was something waiting to be said. "Hey," she said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Can I ask you something?" I looked up from my book, meeting her gaze. "Of course." She hesitated, her pencil stilling against the paper. "Do you ever think about how weird all this is? Us, I mean. This whole step-sibling thing." The question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly normal, right? We didn't grow up together or anything." "Exactly," she said, her voice gaining momentum. "It's not like we're real siblings. We're just two people who happen to live under the same roof because our parents fell in love." I could see where she was going with this, and my heart started to race. "Yeah, I guess that's true." She set down her pencil and leaned back against the couch, her eyes searching mine. "Does that ever feel complicated to you?" The air between us seemed to thicken, and I struggled to find the right words. "It does, sometimes." She nodded, looking relieved, like she'd been holding on to that question for a long time. Me too. Later that week, something happened that turned our world upside down. Melissa had been clearing out some old papers, sorting through boxes she'd brought over when she moved in. I was helping her carry a stack of files into the office when one slipped from the pile, scattering its contents across the floor. "Sorry," I said, kneeling to gather the papers. One caught my eye, a birth certificate with Becca's name on it. "Don't worry about that," Melissa said quickly, taking the papers from my hands. But something about the way she said it, the tightness in her voice, made me pause. "Is everything okay?" I asked. She hesitated, then sighed. There's something I probably should have told you both a long time ago. That evening, Melissa and my dad sat us down in the living room. Becca and I exchanged confused glances, unsure what to expect. There's no easy way to say this, Melissa began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Becca's biological father isn't who I've always told her he was. Becca's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Melissa took a deep breath. The man I was married to when you were born wasn't your real father. He never knew, and I never told anyone until now. The room went silent. I could see the shock on Becca's face, her mind racing to process what she'd just heard. So, I'm not related to anyone here, Becca said finally, her voice quiet but steady. Melissa shook her head. No, you're not. I felt a rush of emotions, relief, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite name. Becca wasn't my stepsister, at least not in the way we'd always thought. It was a strange realization, one that seemed to change everything and nothing all at once. That night, Becca and I found ourselves in the backyard again, sitting side by side on the grass. The stars above us seemed brighter than usual, their light cutting through the inky darkness. Crazy day, huh? She said, her voice laced with humor but tinged with something deeper. Yeah, I said, exhaling slowly. How are you feeling? She shrugged, pulling her knees to her chest. Weird. It's like everything I thought I knew about myself isn't true anymore, but at the same time I feel kind of free. Free? I asked, turning to look at her. She nodded. Yeah, like there's no weird family label hanging over us anymore. It's just us. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My heart started to pound, and I couldn't tell if it was from excitement or fear. Becca, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. What? I hesitated, my chest tightening. I care about you. A lot. More than I probably should. Her expression softened, and for a moment I thought she might laugh. But instead she reached out, her hand brushing against mine. I know, she said quietly. Me too. I wasn't sure who moved first, but the next thing I knew, her lips were on mine. The world seemed to stop, the stars above us blurring into a kaleidoscope of light. Her touch was soft but electric, igniting something inside me that I hadn't realized was there. When we finally pulled apart, she looked at me, her cheeks flushed and her eyes shining. This feels right, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It does, I agreed, my heart racing. It really does. For the first time, there were no questions, no doubts, no barriers between us. It was just us, two people who had found something unexpected and undeniable in each other. And in that moment, it felt like we were exactly where we were meant to be. The days following that night under the stars felt like stepping into a new world, one that was both thrilling and a little uncertain. Becca and I had crossed a line, but it didn't feel wrong. If anything, it felt like we'd finally acknowledged something that had been simmering between us all along. There was no grand announcement or dramatic confrontation. We simply let things unfold, finding moments to steal glances, share quiet laughter, and talk about everything and nothing. The air between us felt lighter, as though we'd finally shed the weight of confusion and doubt. One evening, about a week after our kiss, we decided to take a drive to the edge of town. It was one of those warm, golden summer nights where everything seemed to glow, the sky painted with streaks of pink and orange. Becca had suggested the outing, insisting that she knew a place I'd love. We ended up at a secluded overlook. The city sprawled out beneath us like a sea of lights. She pulled a blanket from the trunk, and we sat together on the hood of her car, the cool metal beneath us grounding the surreal moment. I used to come here when I needed to think, she said, her voice soft. It always made me feel like anything was possible. It's beautiful, I said, glancing at her. But I wasn't looking at the view. I was looking at her. She turned to me, her expression serious but calm. So, what happens now? The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I took a deep breath, my fingers brushing against hers. "We figure it out," I said. "One step at a time." A small smile played on her lips. "That sounds like a plan." We sat there for a while, the silence between us comfortable and full of promise. When she leaned her head against my shoulder, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. This was where I wanted to be, where I was meant to be. Over the next few weeks, we navigated our new relationship with care, testing the waters and finding a rhythm that worked for us. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of doubt, times when we worried about what others might think, and the occasional awkward conversation with our parents. Melissa and my dad had noticed the shift between us, though they didn't say much. One evening over dinner, Melissa gave us a knowing smile. "You two seem to be getting along really well lately," she said, her tone light but pointed. Becca and I exchanged a glance, unsure how to respond. But my dad, ever the pragmatist, simply shrugged. "That's a good thing," he said, cutting into his steak. "It's nice to see you two connecting." After that, we stopped worrying so much about hiding our feelings. We weren't doing anything wrong, and we didn't owe anyone an explanation. What we had was ours, and that was enough. One weekend, we decided to take a trip to the beach. It was Becca's idea, a chance to get away from everything and spend some time just being together. We packed a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, loaded up her car with towels and sunscreen, and hit the road. The beach was almost empty when we arrived, the horizon stretching out endlessly before us. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was soothing, a reminder of how vast and unpredictable life could be. We spent the day swimming, laughing, and lounging in the sand. At one point, as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Becca turned to me, her eyes sparkling. "Race you to the water?" she challenged. "You're on," I said, already sprinting toward the waves. She let out a laugh, chasing after me, her footsteps kicking up sand. When we reached the water, she splashed me mercilessly, her laughter echoing across the beach. I grabbed her waist, pulling her close as the waves lapped around us. "You cheated," she accused, though there was no malice in her tone. "Did not," I said, grinning. "You're just slow." She rolled her eyes, but her smile softened as she looked at me. "You're impossible, you know that?" "Yeah," I said, my voice quieter now. "But you like me anyway." She didn't reply, not with words at least. Instead, she kissed me, her arms wrapping around my neck as the ocean swirled around us. It was a kiss filled with everything we couldn't say: gratitude, hope, and a promise of what was to come. By the time we got back home, the sun had set and the house was dark and quiet. We sat on the porch steps, her head resting against my shoulder as we watched the fireflies flicker in the yard. "Do you think this will last?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at her, my heart swelling with a mix of certainty and determination. "Yeah," I said, "I do." She smiled, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "Me too." In that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. It wouldn't always be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. What mattered was that we'd found each other, not just as step-siblings or friends, but as partners, and that was enough. Epilogue. Moving forward. Months turned into years, and our lives shifted and grew in ways we couldn't have imagined. Becca graduated with her degree in graphic design, landing a job at a boutique agency that adored her creativity. I finished school too, finally settling into a career that felt right. Through it all, we stayed by each other's side, navigating the highs and lows as a team. Our parents, to their credit, were supportive, even if it took them a little while to fully understand. They saw how happy we made each other, how much we'd grown together, and in the end, that was all that mattered to them. Becca and I didn't rush things. We took our time, building a life together step by step. But on a warm spring day, standing in the backyard where so many of our moments had unfolded, I slipped a ring onto her finger and promised to love her for the rest of my life. She said yes, her smile brighter than the sun, and in that moment, everything felt right. We weren't bound by labels or expectations. We were simply us, two people who had found something rare and beautiful in each other. And as we looked toward the future, hand in hand, I knew we could face whatever came our way. Together. Always.